How much responsibility do we carry for our fellow Jews? The reason I ask that question is because we do know that we are responsible for our fellow Jews to a greater or less extent. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we feel it or not, we know that if a fellow Jew does something that's out of line, we're all going to get the flack. We know that we have a responsibility. The Torah tells us we have a responsibility to look out for our fellow Jew, both in terms of their personal needs, financial needs, also in terms of their spiritual needs. So the question is, how deep does this run? How deep is our level of responsibility to each other? And I'm sure people have different perspectives, what kind of responsibility we have, what kind of Jews we're responsible for, who we're allowed to say, enough, we're not getting involved. But sometimes the path to answering a question like this starts in an unlikely place. And in our particular conversation, we're going to start in a legal place, meaning to say, there's somewhere in the halachas, in the laws of Judaism, that actually mandate responsibility that a person has for somebody else. And I'm not talking about in some philosophical sense, I'm not talking about in some abstract sense, I'm talking in a very pragmatic way. There's a certain halachic scenario where one person can assume responsibility for another person. So, I don't know if you could think of an example, but I'm saying plain black and white halachic where you become responsible for another person.
Slaves.
Okay, slave is something that wouldn't apply nowadays.
What about
It's something that would apply across the board.
parents?
Okay, so a parent, it's a good point. A parent is responsible obviously for their children. That's not a surprise to us.
But in later stages, a child could become responsible for a parent.
Okay, and correct, and a child could become responsible for a parent. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily something which is unusual that needs to be mandated by the Torah. You hopefully expect that people feel that level of responsibility or that level of care.
It's one of the 10 commandments.
Is what?
Honor your parents.
That's right, honor your parents. Honor your parents does not mean you're responsible for them.
Your wife.
All right, your wife, there we go, that's in this week's parasha. It says very clearly in this week's parasha that you are responsible for your wife. You have to care for your wife. You have to provide both financially and emotionally. You have to provide. That's true. So here's a very interesting example that we're going to look at, and that is an example where a person volunteers responsibility for another person. And that is in the context of a loan. So I borrow money from you. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you lend me money, but let's say I borrow money from you, and in order to facilitate the fact that you're going to lend me the money, I ask somebody to stand surety on the loan. So that person who stands surety is now volunteering to take responsibility for the loan on my behalf. Okay, it's a very mundane kind of, black and white scenario, right? You take responsibility for somebody's loan. I mean, how difficult is that? And that's obvious that the person is now responsible for the loan because they've put their name on the line. They've undertaken to underwrite the person's loan.
Depends whether you go Bavli or Yerushalmi.
Correct, exactly. As we shall see.
As we learned last night.
Right? As they shall see. You mean he did it to me again. So the question here is, this principle of standing surety as a loan, for a loan on somebody else's behalf, that cannot extend beyond that. Cannot tell us more than just the story of financial responsibility that you take for another person. So before we get into the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, as you pointed out, right, that there are different perspectives in the Gemara, I want to ask from a simple, logical perspective. At which stage of the loan process does a person become the guarantor on the loan? So at which point do you take, just logically, at which point do you assume surety on a loan? Just purely logically. When would you say that it happens? What? When they default, okay? When they default is when you actually have to pay. That's not when you became the surety.
As soon as you sign.
As soon as who signs what?
The guarantor.
Okay, so you sign as the guarantor. And when are you going to do that? What do you mean as soon as you sign? So what happens if you sign a day before the loan is due?
It's as soon as you make the decision.
So, but how do I know if you've made the decision? You have to sign. So when typically does a person stand surety for a loan? Just typically.
Transaction's done.
When it's done. So you're saying, I'm going to borrow money from you, so you're going to lend me the money, then I'm going to go look for the surety.
No.
No. Okay, so when does it normally happen?
Before.
Before. Oh, okay. So logically, in order for you to advance me the money, logically, I've already brought the surety to the table.
Right.
Otherwise, you don't feel secure in this loan. So logically, the time when a person steps in as the guarantor, as the surety on the loan, is typically before the loan happens. Logically, right? What happens if a guy decides he wants to stand surety to the loan after the loan has already been made? Is that an option? So, in other words, you borrow money, the term of the loan is, let's say, 6 months. 3 months in, a person comes forward and says, I am willing now to stand surety on your loan, post facto. Is that binding? Is that binding? The loan's already happened. So is that now binding? Come after the fact.
Is he taking over ownership from another person?
Okay, it's a good question. So let's assume not. Let's assume there was no surety prior to this. And this guy just comes forward and he says, okay, I'm going to stand surety to the loan. Is that binding or not? Okay, interesting conversation. Is it binding or not? So the story goes as follows. Right at the end of the Gemara Bava Basra. So the Gemara Bava Basra actually doesn't really speak mainly about loans. The Gemara Bava Basra mainly speaks about property law. But all the way in the final Mishnah of Bava Basra, there's this conversation. It's the question of whether a person who steps forward as a guarantor, as surety on a loan, after the loan is already in effect, if the creditor can now claim from them or not. Okay? So before we answer that question, because obviously this is Jewish law, so we've got to make it a little bit more complex. Before we answer that question, there's another thing to take into consideration, which is when a creditor comes to claim their loan, if the debtor cannot pay, what rights does the creditor have? So the guy doesn't have cash. What rights does the creditor have? Guy's got no money. The loan is due. What could he do now?
He's
Go
referred
to
to
the
as property.
guarantor.
I'm saying, let's assume there's no guarantor. He's going to attach property, right? That's what he could do. Go to the sheriff and he can attach property against his loan, right? So the halacha is that there are two kinds of property that a person might have, or two kinds of assets that a person might have. There's what's called nechasim b'nei chorin. That means regular assets that are just sitting within the person's portfolio of ownership. And then there's what's called nechasim meshubadim, which means, let's say that the loan, he took the loan 6 months ago, and now this guy in the 6 months interim, sold a property. Because in Israel, in halachic terms, you don't own property. You get like this 49-year lease. And then in the Yovel year, the properties all go back to the original family members. So technically, it's still his asset, but it's his asset that is currently beholden to somebody else. Or let's say that a person transacted with somebody else using some of their assets. So these assets are now tied up in other business affairs. So generally speaking, depends on the circumstances. Generally speaking, anytime that a person carries a debt, if the debt is with a document and witnesses, we consider it to be public knowledge, and you shouldn't have gotten involved with this guy, and you shouldn't have transacted over his assets, because you know there's a creditor, and there's a possibility the creditor is going to come after the assets that you've actually gotten involved in. So usually we say that the creditor actually even has the right to go after property that is tied up in other affairs, assuming those affairs began after the loan. Here the law is this. You have Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says that if a guy puts his hand up and decides to become surety on a loan after the loan was already in effect, so on the 3-month mark, I'm just using that as an arbitrary number, then the creditor can claim from the surety, but not from any of his assets that are tied up in other affairs. But the point is, according to Rabbi Yishmael, if a guy decides to become the surety after the loan is already in progress, we can go after him. The creditor can go after him. It is binding. Now there's a great sage by the name of Rabbi Yosef ben Nanas, but the Mishnah typically only refers to him as Ben Nanas. And he clearly was a big expert on transactional law, property law, other types of financial claims. That was his area of expertise. He says to Rabbi Yishmael, I don't agree with you. You can't just step in as a surety after the loan is already in effect and now have that responsibility. He says, I don't agree. And I said, I'll illustrate it to you. But the way he illustrates it is with a very dramatic example. And this dramatic example is going to be the linchpin for us trying to understand the degree of responsibility that one Jew has for another. So what's the story? So Dave's walking in the street in the middle of Glen Hazel, and he sees that there's some big guy with bulging biceps and a little yarmulke on his head, holding another guy literally by his neck, choking him in the street, saying, where's my money? And Dave's a nice guy, so he's worried that this could go south. So he runs over and he says, leave him alone, I'll pay you whatever he owes you. In other words, he's now stepping in as a guarantor, a surety on the loan. And obviously after the loan has already been effected, because this guy's already at the point that he's assaulting the debtor in the middle of the street to get his money. So Ben Nana says, you tell me, does Dave have to now actually stand surety for the loan? Or was he just being a nice guy, trying to stop a person from being assaulted in the street? That's an interesting discussion. And essentially he uses that to argue that you can only stand surety on a loan before the loan takes place, because it's a mechanism that makes the loan occur, essentially, because the guy lends the money because he knows that he has recourse to the surety, to the guarantor. But after the thing has already happened, what does it help to jump in now and start to saying that you're going to stand guarantee on the loan? Doesn't make any sense, especially in this radical example where the guy's assaulting a person in the middle of the street, and you can't make him financially liable just because he wanted to prevent somebody from, God forbid, being badly injured or worse. So Rabbi Yishmael says, you know what, I got to tell you, if you want to really sharpen your mind, then you have to learn Gemara. Okay, he didn't really say Gemara because Rabbi Yishmael lived before the Gemara. He says you got to learn Jewish law. Not just the bottom line, black and white Jewish law. You've got to learn the mechanisms of how we arrive at the conclusions of Jewish law. That's what you've got to learn. You want to sharpen your mind, that's what you've got to learn. And out of Jewish law, if you really want to sharpen your mind, you have to learn the laws that are associated with finances, particularly transactions, loans, those kinds of things, because they are so nuanced and they're so complex that will really, really sharpen your mind. And if you want to have the ultimate teacher of those laws, you should go to Ben Nanas. Now, Ben Nanas has just disagreed with him. So it sounds like he's acceding to, okay, listen, he's right. Like, he's such a brilliant scholar. He's right. But when the Gemara analyzes this debate between Rabbi Yishmael and Ben Nanas, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yishmael was speaking about how scholarly Ben Nanas was, but the fact is he still disagreed with him. So in other words, he's saying, if you want a great teacher, go to Ben Nanas. He's a great teacher. But you want to know the bottom line? The bottom line is that you could become the surety on a loan even after the loan has already been signed off, even if it's months after the loan has been signed off, even if it's because you're stopping somebody from being beaten in the street. You could step in and you could take over the loan. In other words, Rabbi Yishmael, and the Gemara concludes that this is, in fact, the decision halachically. Rabbi Yishmael says, at any point in time, you are entitled to step in and to become the guarantor on a loan, even if the loan has already been in place for a long period of time. So in other words, you can hear the undercurrent of what he's saying is that we carry a lot of responsibility for our fellow Jews, because look at that. I can step in at any time and take some of the load or responsibility off a fellow Jew. That obviously means we have a tremendous responsibility to each other. However, there is a little twist in the tale. The twist in the tale is that Rabbi Yishmael, when the Gemara concludes how to apply, because that's often what happens, right? You have an opinion that is shared in the Mishnah, and then the Gemara analyzes that opinion and brings the debates around that opinion, and then the proofs and the counter proofs, etc., until eventually it settles on what we're actually supposed to do. And when it settles on what we're actually supposed to do, very often the Gemara will add information that we did not see originally in the original presentation. And so the Gemara concludes as follows. Let's say that there's this guy being assaulted on the street because he owes money. And you walk past. And you say, I'm willing to help this man. I'll pay the money. The conclusion of the Gemara is, please God, you've stopped him being beaten in the street. Please God, the creditor steps back and says, okay, let's talk. In which case you've done a mitzvah. You've done a wonderful thing. You saved somebody from a beating, which is a beautiful thing. But that's not enough reason for you to actually carry the financial load. You created a diversion. That's what you did. You stepped in an emergency situation, and you created a diversion which saved the guy from the beating there and then. That is not reason enough for you to actually be financially liable for this loan. If you are to be financially liable for the loan, you would have to perform what is called a kinyan. Now, the direct translation of the word kinyan is a transaction. And the minute you hear the word transaction, you imagine that a transaction implies the exchange of either money or property between two people. That's what you imagine a transaction to be. But in halachic terminology, the idea of a kinyan, of a transaction, is any formalizing of some kind of a deal. For example, in today's world, when you go to a chuppah, so when the chosen commits himself to the contents of the ksuba, he doesn't sign the document, because signing a document has no legal binding status in Torah. Your signature doesn't mean a thing. As a witness, if you sign a document as a witness, that means that you have witnessed that thing. But it doesn't make you liable because you've signed a document. So what does the chassan do in order to commit himself to the contents of the ksuba, which is basically to look after his wife? Okay, that was Freudian. So what does he have to do? A kinyan. We give him a handkerchief, or we give him a yarmulke, and we say in front of the two witnesses, lift up this handkerchief or this yarmulke, which is a kinyan, meaning to say that you are now formally accepting and dedicating yourself to the contents of this document by taking somebody's handkerchief as your own. So a kinyan is a mechanism that you use to put something into effect, to put a deal into effect. So here's the guy beating the other guy in the middle of the street, and Dave comes running in and says, whoa, let him go and I'll pay you. So the creditor is not smart enough, doesn't know the halacha, says, okay, fine. And Dave says, let's go speak to my lawyer. And at this point, obviously, the creditor's cooled off a little bit, and the lawyer says, Dave, you're a wonderful man, you did a beautiful thing, you saved this guy, but you don't owe 1 cent, because you did not formalize your commitment with a kinyan. You didn't do anything formal. You didn't make a document, you didn't lift a handkerchief in front of witnesses, you didn't do anything to formalize the document. Zehu, you're good, you don't have to worry. So that's the conclusion of the Gemara. Yes, you can step in as surety on a loan after the loan has already been put into effect, but in order to do so, you'd have to formalize that. It can't just be a verbal commitment, especially in a crisis situation. Definitely can't be a verbal commitment, because we think that all you're doing is creating a diversion so that the other guy doesn't get beaten up. We know that there are two parallel Talmuds. When the Gemara was written, it was first written in Israel. And then at the same time that the Gemara was being written in Israel, there was a parallel project happening in what was called in those days Babylonia, part of the Roman Empire, that became known as the Gemara we colloquially refer to as the Gemara. So the one that was produced in Babylonia is called the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, and the one that was produced in Israel is called the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi. And they speak about the same topics, but they don't always have the same conclusions. And this is one of those cases, because the Talmud Yerushalmi has this identical conversation. It has different characters. It has Rabbi Yossi, who's the main protagonist of the conversation. And Rabbi Yossi makes a comment which some of the commentaries, I'm not going to get into that level of detail, but some of the commentaries read his comment as this question. Where basically they say, Rabbi Yossi says, this does not make any sense. Here's a guy who owes somebody money. Now he's getting beaten up because he hasn't paid the money. Now you run over to help him. Does it now make sense that the creditor is going to leave the debtor and come after you as the guarantor? Doesn't seem to make sense. That's how most of the commentators explain what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Like I said, I'm not going to get overly technical. But the Rebbe points out that if you read the flow of the Gemara, it does not seem to be that that's what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Rather, what Rabbi Yossi is saying is, very interestingly, that it is possible, not only do we agree with the Bavli, with the Babylonian Talmud, that a person can step in as a guarantor once the loan has already happened, but if you do rush into that situation where the guy is being beaten up, and you say, I'll pay, just the verbal commitment is enough reason to accept responsibility for that loan. So this is this big distinction between the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud about this particular question about a guarantor. They both agree to the possibility that you could step in as a guarantor once the loan is already in effect. They both agree that it's a bit iffy when a person jumps in to save somebody else from being beaten, and therefore we have to be taught that it is possible to actually make yourself liable for the loan even if you're saving somebody from tzoros. But the Babylonian Talmud says you would only carry that responsibility if you formalized it with a process called a kinyan, some kind of formal transaction. Whereas the Jerusalem Talmud says you could just commit yourself verbally, and that would be reason enough to carry the financial burden. And our question obviously is, why do they have these two different opinions? Because we know that the subtext of this whole conversation is, how much responsibility do we carry to our fellow Jew? And if there is an insight into that level of responsibility from the story of a guarantor, well then if the Bavli and the Yerushalmi have different perspectives on what the law is in terms of becoming a guarantor, then they clearly must have different perspectives about how deep our responsibility to our fellow Jew goes. So once we unpack that, we'll be able to learn how much responsibility we carry for our fellow Jews. To get there, what we'll do, please God, tomorrow, is just understand the psychology of a surety and the psychology of the person who's making the loan based on that surety. What is this mechanism and how does it work? And that's where you're going to see the two opinions, the Bavli and Yerushalmi, how a guarantor works. And from that we'll get to understanding how responsibility for our fellow Jew works.